and hello, everybody. It's my great pleasure to welcome today Professor Saswat Samay, who is a professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in the Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur in India, which I had the great pleasure to visit last year for a very exciting graduate school. So Saswat's work brings the philosophy of Deleuze and Guattari into conversation with new materialist thought, with decolonial thought, and the environmental humanities. And he's published many books. He's also been a visiting professor at the Institute of English and American Studies at the University of Oldenburg and in the Department of Anglophone Literature and Culture at Göttingen University. So he's no stranger to Germany. And amongst his recent books is Religion, Politics, and New Materialism, Philosophical Perspectives, edited collection, and many others, which you can see on the MESH website. He has two new books in the pipeline, one of which will, I think, be particularly interesting for this group here today, and that is Deleuze Decoloniality and Planetarity. So I will now hand over to Professor Das to present his lecture.
Thanks, Professor Rigney, Professor Christoph, for giving me this wonderful opportunity for interacting with the academic community at MES at the University of Cologne. It is indeed a great honor for me to be able to deliver an online lecture to all of you. I'll start by drawing your attention to observation made by Alexander Galloway. Alexander Galloway is an American author and professor in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University. Now, he taught breaking up with Deleuze and Guattari was needed because of excessive, popularization of their thinking. He referred to this popularization by what he called peak Deleuze. Now, Galloway's view was rejected by Claire Colebrook in an article she wrote for Deleuze and Guattari Studies in 2020. She argued that if Galloway, with his talk of peak Deleuze, blamed the Deleuzian, rather than Deleuze work as such, then this is to miss the point of the movement begun by 1,000 Platos, which is to maximize infidelity, to create 1,000 tiny peaks of excess, create 1,000 tiny peaks of excess by which philosophy, proliferates to a point of undoing itself. For breaking free from thinkers, she thought that for, breaking free from thinkers who made us imagine life without the worlds was not merely undesirable, but well nigh impossible. Now, Colebrook's view of Deleuze and Guattari reminds one of Ashley Woodward's chapter in John Rolfe and Hannah Stark in Deleuze and the Non-Human. Woodward is a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Dundee and a founding member of the Melbourne School of Continental Philosophy. She drew our attention to Deleuze's creative resuscitation of vitalism and Leban philosophy, two major philosophic movements of late 19th and 20th century, movements that fell into disrepute as they promoted a narrow organicism and biologism that were appropriated by the nationalist, socialist ideologies. These were ideologies, inclined towards restricting the term human, as Elizabeth Gross, puts it, during her interview with Roth and Stark, to the able-bodied, Western, white, civilized, masculine man and forms of control exerted by the category human. However, to clearly avoid the dangerous pitfalls that vitalism and Leban philosophy ran into, Deleuze reformatted the human in relation to life in his writings. For Deleuze, body without organs is traversed, by intensive forces. It's a body operating underneath and prior to the phenomenological, left body. And this body is traversed by intensive forces which are prior to, and give rise to the organism, the organized body. The BWO is not opposed to organ, but to the organism. That is to a particular arrangement of forces in the body, which imprisons life. So in A Thousand Platos, Deleuze and Guattari demand a messianic transformation of human body. The state. Is it really so sad and dangerous to be fed up with seeing your eye, breathing with your lungs, swallowing with your mouth, talking with your tongue, thinking with your brain, having an anus, head, and legs? Why not walk on your head, think with your sinuses, see through your skin, breathe with your belly? Deleuze reformatting mirrors this idea of non-organic life. He's talking about a non-organic life where the focus is on the flow of intensive forces, which operate transversely, laterally in relation to the organism, giving rise to it, flowing over it, and impacting it, from outside and from inside, creating sensations understood as the differential meeting of forces in the BWO. Now, further, Deleuze, doesn't bring about a revival of vitalism and Leban philosophy within contemporary academia, but also accounts for his drive towards demodernizing humanities. Lato's actor network theory and Chakrabarty's planetary thinking exemplifies such a drive that saw how humans embody and remain embedded in non-human forces. Moreover, Deleuze's thorough immersion in the materialist cosmos, an immersion mirrored by his heterodox and heretic lineage, account for the contemporary academia's engagement with non-Western discourses, focusing on the non-human. However, the need of the hour is to create loose networks of assemblages. And we should not be surprised at all if these assemblages remain impacted by Deleuze and Guattari's thinking. For these thinkers, unlike many, remain unparalleled in mapping the concerns of our times. Celebrating 2025 as Deleuze's centenary year, Jan Buchanan says, if one takes the advent of neoliberalism, the collapse of communism, decolonization, sexual liberation, the rise of digital technology, and a move to a globalized economy, among other such culturally tectonic shifts as the start of our century, then it is precisely this century that Deleuze work speaks to. Now, we come to planetarity and decoloniality here. What is the nature of the incommensurability between the planetarity and decoloniality? And what is planetarity and decoloniality? Planetary thinking, planetarizes Anthropocenity, which means it views Anthropocenity as a process integral to the immanent workings of the planet or the ancestrality of Earth, as Quinton Medusa puts it. In contrast, the normative decolonial thinking historicizes Anthropocenity and views it as an Eurocentric phenomenon. Decoloniality goes on to reduce the effects of the non-colonial, non-modern to a spatial clearing outside the zone of anthropocentric history, while planetarity stresses the nullity, the vacuity of the spatializing enterprise, the vacuity and nullity of spatializing geology. Because of Deleuze geology, not unlike Deleuze, as tantamount to matter movement, matter energy, and matter flow. But the new line of decolonial thinkers like Jennifer Clary Lemon and David Grant do not view incommensurabilities between the decolonial and the planetary thinking as antagonizingly divisive. Instead, they view these incommensurabilities as auto-generated processes that need to do their work or initiate a process of producing newer constellations of divergent relations by breaking away from blocks of epistemic deadlocking. But we think a double-pincered exercise, may be needed for creating a site, for synthesizing incommensurabilities between decoloniality and planetarity. That remains inflected by Deleuze and Guattari's thinking, to create these assemblages, to make it more natural and spontaneous. On the one hand, we need to empathize with decolonial retreat from planetarity. On the other, we need to exhaustively rethink decoloniality. Simultaneously, we also need to assess the ethicality of the synthesis. This is because at times, planetarity seems to be an exercise in what Deleuze and Guattari call a double articulation. A double articulation. If on the one hand, Deleuze and Guattari understand Anthropocenity as some sort of heurism that conceptually unifies the human as a species desiring food, energy, art, and a minimum of groundedness. As Arun Saldana and Hannah Stark put it in their specialist to A New Earth, Deleuze and Guattari in the Anthropocene. On the other, they remain committed to creating a non-anthropocentric opening, that imaginative realm where no one owns the truth and everyone has the right to be understood, that imaginative realm of tolerance. Moreover, the series of arguments that the decolonial and the planetary thinking used to consolidate the commitment to create a non-colonial, non-modern aesthesis only expose how these two constitutionally, deviate from each other. We encounter these arguments as we map decolonial and planetary thinkers' engagement with concepts such as earth, planet, subjectivity, anthropocenity, and epistemology. Now, where do we come across this word planetary in case of Deleuze? Deleuze uses the expression planetary in his review of 3 works by the Greek philosopher Kostas Axelos. They're published under the title The Fissure of Anaxagoras and the Local Fires of Heraclitus. His review remains an exercise in double articulation, elucidating yet cautiously withdrawing from Heidegger's take on planetarity, which was inclined towards, differentiating the effective overtones of the planetary from those of being in the world. But why did Deleuze withdraw from Heidegger's take, given that even Deleuze was a philosopher of earth like Heidegger? This is because Deleuze was essentially a philosopher of immanence, and entities, including concepts such as world and the planet, were seen by Deleuze as enmeshed in a co-constitutive co-articulation. For Deleuze, the one remains involved in what expressed it, imprinted in what unfolded it, immanent in whatever manifested it. Expression is in this respect an involvement. Expression for him was a kind of an involvement. Deleuze text shows how he puts forward the image of a complex fold as an example of a kind of osmotic continuity. Arun Saldana notes things and nature are immanent to each other and logically imply and involve each other in time. When a pin drops or a cat sneezes, they are capacitated by nature to do so, but thereby simultaneously use up a little of it and add something to it as well. Substance, on Deleuze's reading, becomes the unfolding of the absolute. It becomes a genetic principle that doesn't pre-exist the modes it expresses itself into, and is itself changed as events happen, so that each form explicates or unfolds the absolute, but the absolute contains or complicates an infinity of form. On the other hand, in his Origin of Work of Art, Heidegger viewed the planet as a scientifically deducted abstraction, while positing the earth and the world as fully individuated singularities. For Heidegger, the earth and the world were caught up in a mutually supplementing interplay, where the world saved the earth and the earth served the world. But Heidegger, humanist imaginary, edged closer to creating a binary divide between the two, positing the world as a site of superior value and prominence in relation to earth, because the former had the potential to save the earth. In his critical essay, The Planet, an Emergent Humanist Category, Dipesh Chakrabarty wrote, Martin Heidegger pronounced the word planet as being of no interest to philosophers when he introduced earth as a philosophical category in 1936, distinguishing it carefully from the word planet. What this word says, he wrote, is not to be associated with the idea of a mass of matter deposited somewhere, or with the merely astronomical idea of a planet. In the same essay, Chakrabarty quoted lines from Heidegger's text to show the manner in which he stressed the prominence of the world in relation to earth. He says, upon the earth, this is Heidegger, upon the earth and it, historical man grounds his dwelling in the world. Or as he put it in another essay, earth is a serving bearer, blossoming and fruiting, spreading out in rock and water, rising up into plant and animal. When mortals dwelled on earth, they saved it. Saving, Heidegger explained, doesn't snatch something from a danger. To save the earth is more than to exploit it or even wear it out. Saving the earth doesn't master the earth and doesn't subjugate it, which is merely one step from spoliation. Human worlds and the earth are in a relationship of strife and are yet mutually bonded. World and earth are essentially different from one another, writes Heidegger, and yet are never separated. The world grounds itself on the earth. The world grounds itself on the earth, and the earth juts through the world. The opposition of the world and the earth is striking. It was 34 years after that the term planetary was used, and it was used by Gayatri Chakravarty Spivak in a book, Death of a Discipline. Spivak remained indifferent to Deleuze's emphasis on the co-articulation between the world and the planet that stood opposed to Heidegger's positioning of the planet as a scientifically deducted abstraction, partly because she saw Deleuze's works as embodiments of French colonial history. Cut off from the post-colonial concerns, Spivak went on to extend this criticism in a Can the Subaltern Speak. As he said, everything Deleuze and Foucault read is caught within the debate of the production of the non-European other, and that these authors buy a self-contained version of the West, ignoring the effects of global imperialism on Western integration. Hence, they make claims and assumptions in general, global local terms, which are applicable only to the West. In this sense, Spivak's post-colonization of the planetary was directed at expressing the particular locationality where the planet was situated in relation to globe and subject. This stood against thinking about the planet dogmatically, seeing it as an undivided space or as an alternate description of the globe, susceptible to nation-state politics. Instead, she saw the planet, planet for her was more than geological, where random means nothing, where no individual thoughts can weigh. So she chose to situate the planet in the species of alterity, while she saw the globe as the expression of the colonial politics of control. She stated in a write-up on Planetarity that the globe is on our computers. No one lives there. The global notion allows us to think that we can aim to control globality. The planet is in the species of alterity, belonging to another system, and yet we inhabit it on loan. However, Spivak claimed that planet's constitutional alterity stood underived from us. It stood underived from us. It was very integral to us. In other words, instead of dialectically negating us, it paradoxically contained us as much as it flung us away. Spivak aimed at showing how agency and autonomy of subjects were contingent upon planet's workings. For Spivak, what the planet did to organize subjectivities when it contained them when it contained them, was dialectically opposed to what it did to them in the process of expelling or ejecting them out. In the first case, it destabilized or agitated, unsettled the organized clarity of the subjects, making them integral to the uncanny forces it held. In the second case, it bestowed on subjects their autonomy and agency. For Spivak, planetary containment and expulsion of subjects captured the non-identity at the heart of nature. Spivak's view is supplemented by that of Adrian Johnston, who states, nature is not some placid organic evenness, undisturbed by any destabilizing imbalance. Rather, it is perturbed from within itself. The subject is thus the name of the fissure by way of which nature becomes alien to itself. It is the push of natural substance to produce its own otherness. Pulling out a phrase from Jacques Lacan, Seminar 11, we could say that there is something in nature more than nature itself. And this extra something, this exteriority, which is also interior, is the human subject, which nature generates out of itself. However, Spivak was not merely concerned with stressing the planetary origin of subjects, agency and autonomy. Rather, she stressed the particularity of space and time to which they fell into, after the expulsion from the planetary. But subjects for her did not emanate from what, Heidegger called a clearing with the expulsion, because as, thinkers like Peter Stoltenberg point out, such clearings where there was a break in the opacity of nature, where a patch of sky opened up, making it possible to look up, and where there was enough light for Dasein to note its own existence, simply did not exist in the human world. So for her, subjects were thrown into a deeply stratified, deeply divided world, divided by particularities of space and time, and knowledge. And knowledge of such a world was necessary for working out a robust praxis of political reconstruction that could yield subjects autonomy and freedom from paralyzing stratifications. Now, when it comes to Chakrabarty, the impact that Deleuze and Guattari had on him can be felt in his writings, which continuously straddles the post-human and the post-colonial divide. In some parts of his writings, his post-human orientation stands out, in particular, where he remains inclined to show, as William A. Connolly said, how volatile planetary forces set on deep time became imbricated with national and global human histories, or how temporalities set on a different scales and vectors of time periodically intersected. Yet he remains equally inclined towards producing a broader or a more inclusive assemblage of post-colonial thinking, while the question whether singular subjectivities may be produced within stratigraphic time frame, as Colebrooke says, concerns Spivak Chakrabarty. Concerns Spivak, Chakrabarty attempts to rework Deleuze and Guattari's conceptual ideas to produce an assemblage of non-ontological planetary subjectivity. Now, his reworking also leads him to provincialize Anthropocenity, viewing structural displacement in natural cycles or processes of the planet, which for him remains essentially generative, accounting for planets' renewal and expansion. Chakrabarty doesn't disagree with the eco-critical view that humans are the main drivers of climatic changes, but at the same time is equally hesitant to see these changes as taking the earth to a point of extinction. Chakrabarty shows how changes in the interaction between the physical, chemical, and biological processes account for the planet's sustainability. Okay. Yet for him, the planet stands altogether indifferent to the combination of human and non-human agencies that bring about these changes. So he doesn't dwell on multiple human-centered developments such as colonialism, capitalism, industrial revolution, advent of modernity, etc., accountable for the current ecological crisis. Instead, he focuses on the absence of scientific evidence which may establish a direct link between such anthropocentric developments and ecological crisis. In a bid to find a clearing beyond and against the so-called anthropocenic debates, he refers to the claim made by Lee R. Kump, James F. Castring, and Robert G. Crane in their book on the Earth system. He quotes from that book, the amount of atmospheric oxygen has remained within habitable bounds for complex animal and planet life despite all the oxygen molecules having been replaced over 100 times. This remarkable stability of the share of oxygen in the atmosphere, allowing us to breathe, is ensured by the Earth system, or what I have called the planet. Earth system scientists appear to agree that different forms of life, both on land and in the sea, the rate of burial of organic carbon in the sea, the phosphorus and long-term carbon cycles of the planet, all have a role to play in maintaining the share of oxygen in the atmosphere that allows complex life to flourish. The planetary ultimately is about how some very long-term planetary processes involving both the living and the non-living have provided and keep providing the enabling conditions for both human existence and flourishing. His Deleuze and Guattari-driven post-human orientation also leads him to show how subjects, due to their embeddedness in the planetary immanence, lack sovereign agency to bring about planet's extinction. But he doesn't break away from Spivakian post-colonial concerns either. Spivak works with biological concept of human species. For without this concept, he cannot be concerned with, as Amal Treacher puts it, how to recognize the other as other in all their complexity, that he or she becomes a truly human, or how to know the other as mortal and active human being in a mosaic of non-identical relationships. Chakrabarty also does the same, for which he draws criticism from philosophers such as Deborah Daroski and anthropologist Eduardo Riveros de Castro in their compelling and thoughtful book, The Ends of the World. In his critical essay, Postcolonial Studies and the Challenge of Climate Change, he states, unlike the changes in the climate this planet has seen in the past, the current warming is anthropogenic in nature. Humans collectively now have an agency in determining the climate of the planet as a whole, a privilege reserved in the past only for very large geophysical forces. For sustaining such a bio-organized, biological concept of human subjects, he also draws criticism from likes of Thomas Nail. In his We Have Always Been Planetary, Nail states, for my part, I cannot accept Chakrabarty's claim that culture and nature are connected but different conceptual entities. For me, nature is not a human concept. It is what we are. Indeed, concepts themselves are already natural and not opposed to some external, non-conceptual nature. Nature doesn't decenter the centered human. There is no central human because humans are nothing but Earth itself. Our stories are nature's stories that it tells through us. Our stories are parodies and inside jokes. Nature tells itself through human cultures. This is what makes nature such a trickster. However, Chakrabarty can always be used for giving a new turn to postcolonial project aimed at creating non-identitarian humans. In his postcolonial studies and the challenge of climate change, once again, he states this non-human force, like a mode of existence of the human, tells us that we are no longer simply a form of life that is endowed with a sense of ontology. Humans also have a sense of ontic belonging that is undeniable. We use that knowledge in developing both anti-colonial, feminist, post-colonial criticism. But in becoming a geophysical force on the planet, we have also developed a form of collective existence that has no ontological dimension. Right. Now, we come to decoloniality. In contrast, the genesis of decolonial thinking, lay in Frantz Fanon's Wretched of Earth. For Fanon, the naked truth of decolonial resistance lay in the violence it produced. Lay in the violence it produced. This was not much a destructive violence. Rather, it had a cleansing effect on its perpetrators. For Fanon, the disinherited or wretched, in rising against the system, became the new men, gaining an authority and dignity previously denied to them. Fanon's reconstruction of violence entailed a rejection of Gandhi's socially acceptable nonviolent resistance. This is because Fanon saw this form of resistance as tantamount to preserving the capitalist colonialist state. In this sense, decolonial thinking was an intellectual ally of the violence that actual decolonial struggle entailed. Decolonial thinkers' determination to violently withdraw into and treat indigenous knowledge systems as exclusive entities that were either aggressively indifferent or at loggerheads with knowledges complicit with colonial modernity, in this sense, was a violent reaction to European colonization. This is because European colonization was directed not merely at regressively orientalizing epistemologies of the non-West, rather it was a full-fledged exercise in cultural genocide. To reiterate how cultural genocide by the European colonizers accounted for the decolonial valorization of indigenous or local epistemologies may not be so much required here. Still, a few lines from Mignolo and Quisano may be pulled out to show why retreat into and subsequent valorization of indigenous knowledge systems exist as an ethical praxis for decoloniality. Quisano states, it is the instrumentalization of reasons for power, of colonial power in the first place, which produced distorted paradigms of knowledge and spoiled the liberating promises of modernity. The alternative then is clear, the destruction of coloniality of world power. First of all, epistemological decolonization, as decoloniality is needed to clear the way for new intercultural communication, for an interchange of experiences and meanings as a basis of another rationality, which may legitimately pretend to some universality. Mignolo goes on to supplement Quisano's take, as he says, modern colonial racism, that is the logic of racialization that emerged in the 16th century, has two dimensions, the one single purpose, to rank as inferior all languages beyond Greek and Latin and the 6 modern European languages from the domain of sustainable knowledge, and to maintain the enunciative privilege of the Renaissance and Enlightenment European institutions, men and categories of thought. Languages that were not apt for rational thinking were considered languages that reveal the inferiority of human beings speaking them. Scholars such as Marco Vieira observed in his decolonial subject and the problem of non-Western authenticity that the decolonial project was somewhat utopian, with contemporary focus on hybridization of knowledge systems, which preclude any meaningful sense of authenticity based on either the construction or the restoration of a supposedly immaculate non-Western other. Yet, decoloniality conscious retreat into indigenous epistemologies gave rise to Mignolo's border or immigrant consciousness. This is a consciousness that the decolonial thinkers work with while approaching critical assemblages of new humanities. What expresses this consciousness best is decolonial rejection of the planetary reconstruction of the human that remains heavily inflected by Deleuze and Guattari's reduction of human body to a point synthesizing pre-individual forces. If decolonial thinkers aim to retrieve an authentic non-Western subject as if he were a stable monolith lying buried under the wounds inflicted by the global system of coloniality, Chakrabarty appropriates Rohit Vemula's words, "I am made up of ancient stardust, the glory of ancient stardust, to create a planetary identity." Standing opposed to caste particularisms, such an identity remains inclined to show how planetarization of subjectivity begins with a realization that bodies are constituted by a virtual multiplicity indiscernible to apparatuses of capture. The best example of how Deleuze radically reconstructs the human is provided by Claire Colebrook in an article, Victorian Studies in the Anthropocene, an interview with Claire Colebrook, while responding to a question put to her by Peter Atkins related to her book Twilight of the Anthropocene. She indicates how Chakrabarty reformats human according to what Deleuze and Guattari perceive as interconnected networks, pacts, and alliances. She states, Chakrabarty says that while we used to separate human history from natural history, we can't do it anymore. Humans are bound up with the planet. If you want to explain Jane Austen, you can't just talk about Britain. You have got to talk about the slave trade. And if you talk about the slave trade, you have to talk about the damage to the planet. And if you talk about the damage to the planet, you need to talk about species migrations and human migration. Decolonial thinkers even oppose reconstruction of Anthropocenity by Chakrabarty, for he seems more inclined towards stressing its universality. He sees Anthropocenity as an inalienable facet of the indigenous worldview, unlike Ghos's Living Mountains, which situates Anthropocenity as a phenomenon external to indigeneity. In his 2022 article that he wrote, Planetary, Humanities, Straddling the Decolonial Postcolonial Divide, Dipesh Chakrabarty doesn't approach Anthropocenity as an obnoxious totality, mirroring the colonial desire of the geopolitical West, but views it as tantamount to desire for growth and development. In his article, he firmly establishes this equation while critiquing decolonial understanding of indigeneity and locality. Chakrabarty states, there's no politics of planetary predicaments of humans without dealing with issues of climate justice that have to do profoundly with the emancipatory aspirations and expectations, and not just fossilized carbon that still fuel the desire for growth and development in the new populist nations that have now experienced for decades the phenomenon of mass poverty. There's nothing morally wrong as such with humans wanting to live better and longer, so long as they did not imperil themselves. Besides, while I agree with Latour, De Castro, and others that the consumerist model of capitalist development is unsustainable For most humans, nothing guarantees De Castro's hope that a climate disaster resulting in permanently diminished human capabilities will give humanity yet another chance at flourishing by making the right use of the accumulated wisdom of the indigenous non-modern that may or may not come to pass. Similarly, by marking the desire for scientific growth and development as modern in his article, Planetary Crisis and the Difficulty of Being Modern, Chakrabarty goes on to universalize modernity by claiming that even the decolonial struggles, whose uniqueness lay in delinking from Anthropocenic modernity, were committed to modernization. He goes on to universalize modernity by claiming that even the decolonial struggles, whose uniqueness lay in delinking from Anthropocenic modernity, were committed to modernization. He states all anti-colonial nationalisms were programmatically committed to modernization. The project of making the nation modern, Nehru, Nasser, Mao, Ho Chi Minh, Julius Nyerere, Sukarno, Leopold Senghor, M.S. Azar were all radical modernizers, gigantic in their own national context, and inspired by a variety of models of economic development, ranging from the American to the Soviet ones. These were men who embodied the desires of those in the world who, in the wake of the rise of European nations to world dominant status, always wanted to be modern. Initiated by Chakrabarty with a grandiose time of coexistence, stratigraphy of the Anthropocene. Using Deleuze and Guattari's idea of stratigraphy, she dwells on the undesirability of effecting an apocalyptic rupture with Anthropocenity and persuades us to rethink transformative politics stratigraphically rather than in chronic terms. She argues if one can think stratigraphically, that one would not say that philosophical concepts and periods are superimposed like geological strata, but that superimposition or coexistence is the plane of immanence with all the temporalities, chronologies, histories, and events of life existing at once. Nothing is the ground or foundation for anything else. Second, and more specifically, if one can think of geological explanation and stratification as one layer of time existing alongside the history of philosophy and the history of social formations, and if the stratigraphic superimposition thinks as if there were no before and after, one would generate a new ethics and a new politics. One would generate a new ethics and politics. Right. It is such a first to creatively rethink Anthropocenity, or to provincialize it, expand it, to defamiliarize it, that decolonial politics stands averse to. But by doing so, it also withdraws from or remains indifferent to the radical exercise of reason that also includes opening up to esotericism and metaphysics. Secondly, a pithy analysis of decolonial repositioning of locality and indigeneity may even enable one to approach them as complexes integral to the planetary. A brief engagement with Simone, Bignall, and Daryle Rigney's 2019 essay, Indigeneity, Posthumanism, and Nomad Thought, Transforming Colonial Ecologies, we need to revisit that to clarify this. In the chapter, Simone, Bignall, and Daryle Rigney observed that the critical assemblages of new humanities are best considered less as a current break with European modernism and its humanist tradition of progressive enlightenment, and more as a continuation and elaboration of an alternative contemporaneous thread evident within the modern period of Western philosophical thinking about the nature of humanity and human knowledge. Bignall and Rigney also indicate the exemplary ways in which the critical assemblages of new humanities including planetarity and posthumanism, inflected by Deleuze's speculative realism, effects a decisive break from the Hegelianism of modernist tradition. For these thinkers, posthumanism happens to be an important intellectual and political response to Eurocentric modernism. For them, it promises an antidote to the worst excesses of this tradition, which are today evident in a worrying cluster of symptoms of deepening global malaise, including, for example, the erosion of diversity as a consequence of Western cultural imperialism, to socioeconomic catastrophe for the majority of the world's poor, of late capitalism, and anthropocentrism as the genetic condition of environmental collapse and climate change, tipping world society into the age of the Anthropocene. For them, posthumanism intends a certain reversal of the agentic priority and privilege that have attended Western anthropocentric modes of thinking and acting. For them, when human agency is considered as enmeshed in ecological networks, it is no longer valued for its exceptional capacity to transcend existing limits of natural conditions. But Bignall and Rigney also turn towards showing how posthumanism compromises with Deleuze's transversalism that it both rests on and treats as a zone of renewal and rebirth, though its persistent effort to disjunct itself from the Hegelian tradition remains delusion. It remains reluctant to forge productive connections with patterns of non-humanistic dynamism of local indigenous narratives, reducing their differential vibrations and pulsations to ignorable absences or significations of Oriental exoticism. With such reductionism, it continues with and validates colonial extraction policy, which either ignores pre-colonial histories or tacitly appropriates and assimilates them without acknowledging their worth in public. Bignall and Rigney observe these modern human ways of thinking, being and acting, have characterized indigenous ontology, epistemology, axiology, and ethology since time immemorial. And today they constitute a significant site of shared identification across the indigenous world. And yet, on the other hand, according to the terms of its emergence in the Western academy, after humanism, continental posthumanism appears to ignore the prior existence of indigenous knowledges of this kind. In a solipsistic gesture, long typical of Western imperialism, posthumanist theory at times, by remaining blind to the ancient presence and contemporary force of indigenous concepts of human being, this exclusion allows Western philosophy to claim that the new humanities as its current discovery after modern humanism, but this apparently new intellectual frontier, in fact, traces an ancient philosophical terrain already occupied by indigenous epistemologies and associated modes of human experience. In such a scenario, decolonial thinkers such as Mignolo and Quisano seem less interested in working out a new assemblage of decoloniality inclined towards projecting indigenous epistemology in relation to radical experimentation in the new humanities. Rather, these thinkers prescribe an exclusive analysis of local indigenous epistemology with the intent of repositioning the local as an embodiment and a breeding ground of superior values such as resistance, sacrifice, and care in relation to the global space driven by reckless individualism and materialism. Nivedita Majumdar critiques decolonial attempt at fashioning local subjectivities in line with these values in a world in a grain of sand, postcolonial literature and radical universalism. Majumdar argues that such constructions do not express subjects as dynamic performances. Rather, it turns them into effective channels for expressing local particularisms as genetically resistant to global intervention. Eventually, she turns towards reinventing the decolonial ethics of withdrawal into a larger inclusivity grounded on ethics of radical universalism. O'Neill Van Horn, an important critic, who have written about the paradox of place, cultivating particularity and planetarity amid climate catastrophe, offers he goes on to reject the critique when it comes to decolonialist reduction of the local to a detached geospatial unit, a place with a substantial interiority. Horn stresses the processual orientation of the place, only to claim that it doesn't represent the local or vice versa. He states, places are not set of objects. They are ever mattering networks of intertwined matters. The soily substance of land, while no doubt substantive, is hardly a thing at all. Instead, that which grounds our existence, when considered through this process-oriented lenses, reveals itself to be a complex web of becomings, transitions, compositions, decompositions, movements, effects, and energies. Places are at best unstably stable. Horn replaces decolonial attempt to folklore the space or space with such a disclosure. He states this radical encounter with places, with the portion of the world to which we are present, can be considered neither complete subsumption or irreconcilable otherness, so much as processual, plurisingular entanglement of compassion. On the other hand, Chinua Achebe in his Things Fall Apart shows how instead of standing as what Partha Chatterjee calls in his Fragments of Nation, the inner sanctum, the local stands as a highly contestatory zone. This is a zone that not only remains saddled with inner dissensions, fractures, and divides that converge towards producing an irredeemable chaos. Rather, it nurtures processes of internal colonization. In his Things Fall Apart, Achebe shows how indigenous local stands as a breeding ground for alternate colonialisms rather than that of new forms of reasoning and rationality. He positions the Igbo local community not merely as an imperceptible chaotic plane. Instead, he teases out from this plane what stands out as the constitutive strands of the existing biopolitical system, the energetic dimensions of what we now call a control or a surveillance society. The energetic, one gets to encounter such strands, dimensions or codings in what Simone Gandhi calls the Achilles heel in the Igbo epistemology. That is, its blindness or refusal to contemplate its own ethnocentrism. The problematization of the binary distinction between the segmentary society and state by Deleuze Guattari is creatively extended by Chakrabarty to show how organs of the state always are external to rather than being outside of the local. Chakrabarty states there are huge worldwide machines like multinational corporations or religious organizations that enjoy a large measure of autonomy in relation to states. And there are also local mechanisms of bands, margins, minorities, which continue to affirm the rights of segmentary societies. In opposition to the organs of state power, together they constitute the exterior to the state, but not a binary outside. In his post-colonial theory and geographical materialism of desire, which he wrote for Simon Bignall and Paul Patton's Deleuze in the Post-Colonial, John Key Noyes explains this. He says that it is true that at the center, the rural communities are absorbed by the despot's bureaucratic machine, which includes its scribes, its priests, its functionaries. But on the periphery, these communities commence a sort of adventure. They enter into another kind of unit, this time a nomadic association, a nomadic war machine, and they begin to decodify instead of allowing themselves to become overcodified. Whole groups depart. They become nomads. Archaeologists have led us to conceive of this nomadism not as a primary state, but as an adventure suddenly embarked upon by sedentary groups, impelled by the attraction of movement of what lies outside. The nomad and his war machine opposed the despot with his administrative machine, an extrinsic nomadic unit as opposed to an intrinsic despotic unit. And yet the societies are correlated, interrelated. The despot's purpose will be to integrate, to internalize the nomadic war machine, while that of the nomad will be to invent an administration for the newly conquered empire. They ceaselessly oppose one another to the point where they become confused with one another. Despite decolonial attempts to situate the local as a bordered phenomena, the construction of the local, expresses the planetary. A parallax gaze at the local rituals will show how organic humans are both guided, overwhelmed, and dwarfed by material forces constituting the planetary. So what we need at this juncture is a kind of reinventive decoloniality, a decoloniality that would cast a reconstructive gaze at the borders, a gaze that would remain critical of colonial and anthropocentric bordering, yet treat borders as similar to what Peter Sloterdijk calls endogenous spheres or ensouled bubbles, and generated from within existence. Such spheres, according to Sloterdijk, stand as immune structures that enable larger unities and collectivities. Mary Evermorin comments on this. Such spheres are essential to the real reproduction and growth of humans, since we do not or cannot inhabit the outside, even if we still admit with Heidegger that existence is an ecstatic process. We must also recognize that X is also an in. Transcendence is an interior building. Such a decoloniality would not only encourage temporary withdrawal into borders, but view this withdrawal as necessary for opening up new passages. Moreover, phenomenal consciousness is bound to motions of intensive bordering, which adds a new path to the existing one, like a fork or bifurcation, producing a qualitative change or the whole continuous system. As Thomas Nail indicates in his theory of border, borders emerge where there is a continuous process that reaches a bifurcation point. After this point, a qualitative divergence occurs and two distinct pathways can be identified. The result of this bifurcation is that the border is experienced as a continuity by some and as a discontinuity by others. For some people, such as affluent Western travelers, a border may function as a relatively seamless continuity between two areas. For others, such as undocumented migrants, the border may appear as a discontinuous division across which they are forbidden to pass and from which they are redirected. In both cases, what remains primary is the continuous process that actively maintains the border and enforces it as a filter that allows one path or road to continue on ahead and another to be redirected elsewhere through detention, deportation, or expulsion. In other words, the border for Thomas Nail is an active process of bifurcation that doesn't simply divide once and for all, but continuously redirects flows of people and things across or away from itself. In order to create a reinventive decoloniality, Bignall and Rigney provide a Deleuze Guattarian reading of the indigenous critical theorist Jody Byard's approach to indigeneity. Jody Byard suggests indigenous critical theory could be said to exist in its best form when it centers itself within indigenous epistemologies and in the specificities of the communities and cultures from which it supposedly emerges, and then looks outward to engage European philosophical, legal, cultural traditions in order to build upon all the allied tools available. Bignall and Rigney indicate how Deleuze and Guattari map the kinetic patterns of thought. The image of thought is rhizomatic, the core structure being a consistent order or relatively stable interiority, constantly sends creative offshoots that may combine productively with fresh additional material encountered by the thinker, affected by the changing situation in which she or he is embedded. For Deleuze and Guattari, this deterritorializing activity is necessary to free up time-eyed thought for its proper creative vocation. Many might think Deleuzean thinking may be used to attempt a parallax reconstruction of colonialism, equating with foreign authority or an outside force, the arrival of which is almost fated for social structures to undergo transformative change. But such a thought is alien to Deleuze grammatology. Deleuze talks of relational multiplicities rather than aligning with colonialism, which is a violent political ideology of conquest, repulsion, and othering. The overcoming of existential social assemblages happens through a process of interaction, interplay, and encounter, not by appropriation, assimilation, imposition, negation, or conquest, processes that colonialism precipitates. Deleuzean grammar doesn't stand opposed to arrival of nomadic forces, but Deleuze grammar can certainly be used to liberate the forces that apparatuses of colonialism entrap and reorient towards for causing massive devastation, post-eviction, genocide, and ecological violence. In this sense, it may be ideal to synthesize Deleuzean grammar with that of decoloniality. Invested with such a grammar, decoloniality could be an ally of planetarity, facilitating pluriversal encounters with intent of encountering the planet. Therefore, the need of the hour is not merely to produce a site for synthesizing the differences between decoloniality and planetarity. Instead, what we need now is to keep planetarity firmly anchored and open up decoloniality to Deleuze and Guattari's understanding of life, existence, and history. Simone Bignall captures this understanding as he says, every existence has a life that doesn't equate to its history, and history needs to be seen as one which one leaves behind in order to become or to create something new. And lastly, that a life of nations operates in a mode of temporality different from that of their history. Yes, breaking up with Deleuze and Guattari may be impossible because they help us imagine life without worlds we tend to historicize or turn into stories or anecdotes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saswat. You've taken us on quite a journey exploring the complexities of different ways of understanding planetarity and decoloniality and how they might relate. And I think there was a very interesting challenge at the end with this concept of invented decoloniality. It reminds me a little bit of something that I've just been reading recently coming from Australia, which was proposing a transcultural decoloniality, looking very much beyond sort of, Indigenous cultures as kind of separate islands, but actually looking at creative kind of hybridization, conversation, collaboration, mutual transformation, but, with a kind of decolonial orientation, but perhaps more aligned with this inventive kind of mode that you pointed to.